Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on April 19, 2024.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Thank you for coming today. My script that I wrote said, thanks for coming out on this sunny spring day. And I haven't had a chance to edit it, but it is what it is. But I'm Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods. Hopefully only about a year and a half more, but hopefully someone steps forward, That's the prompt. I'd like our board members to stand up or raise their hands. Okay, raising your hands here. And moi, of course. But in any event, these are the people that you can, buttonhole them on your way out, and suggest programs or events or projects. So please help us out. I mean, we've done, I think, a pretty good job in the last 12 years, but we need a little shove. So anyway, you can also email us with such things at civilwarstudygroup@gmail.com. One of the things before we start is we have the annual dinner on May 3rd, and we have some of the forms here. I mean, it's pretty well booked. We're pleased, but there's still going to be some space. So if you want, raise your hand, and Craig Raines, our eminent past president, will come by and give you a form. Now, probably you'll want to talk with Greg Major before you leave. His hand is up. He's in the back corner, holding up the back. As far as if you want to give him money today, or else give him your form with the pledge to mail in the money. And we'll stop you at the door if we didn't get the check. But anyway, this last week saw a return of our judging of the 4th grade history posters. This is something that was put on hiatus during the pandemic. Unfortunately, we returned, and as you can see, in this very room, we had taped to the windows the posters that had gotten blue ribbon status based upon our various judging points that we awarded each poster. And I think I actually saw one or two that I judged, but in the past I felt like I was a meanie. I mean, these are 4th graders after all. But anyway, as you can see, they were very proud of their posters, as they should be. They brought their parents, of course, and then sometimes some siblings, and in some cases, some grandparents. So they were very proud to come here and show off their, and we had, we had snacks for them. This was a very popular table. I overheard this young girl, her mom came late, I guess, because she was coming directly from work, ran up, hugged her mom, and said, hello, Mom, they have good food here. So that's what she was talking about. And we had some special guests. We had Sandy Harrington, our 5th district member on the Orange County School Board, was here. And then also we had the lead 4th grade teacher, Rhonda Persinger, from Locust Grove Elementary School. And this is the look on this child as I'm speaking. And however, rapt attention all the way around. Jill was in that photo. But in any event, so it was a fun time was had by all, and we're glad to be back in that business. We talked about the annual dinner. this has been a favorite of mine. I really like these two books of his, Nowhere to Run, which is the first volume, and then Victory Without Triumph is the second book. And what he does is he talks about, or rather, he recounts the reminiscences of individual soldiers and also officers. And if you're looking for a recitation of the stratagem for particular battle sections in the wilderness battle, don't read this. But this is really very good. So he will be our dinner speaker. And then our buddies at Friends of the Wilderness Battlefield are being very busy. So the weekend before our annual dinner, they have on the 27th of April, and of course at Wilderness Run Vineyards, they have historian Mike Locke talking about the carnage was fearful, the Battle of Cedar Mountain, which of course was in Culpeper County. That's from 1 to 2 p.m. at Wilderness Run's Vineyards. It's free entry, but of course I think you have to pay for any drink that you get. But that should be interesting. And Mike Locke, if I remember correctly, was one of our speakers in the last 3 years. And then, as if that wasn't enough, Friends has something the day after our May 3rd dinner, and also the next day, Sunday. So on May 4th and 5th, they have, oh my God, what do you have stock? This is also at Wilderness Run Vineyards, and this is a special presentation here. So here's their website if you want the information, and then also one of the Bobs, Bob Ed is here. Raise your hand, Bob. There he is, right there. And if you have any information, if you don't want to go to their website, go to Bob. He's right here today. But anyway, then let me see. Okay, so now to today's presentation. Our speaker almost needs no introduction. He has graced us with his knowledge and an introspection concerning multiple Civil War subjects many times over the last 12 years. Some of us are even groupies. But anyway, most of us know his long career as a National Park Service historian, with the last decade or so right here in our backyard as chief historian for the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Military Park. Let's see, he retired in 2021 after a 40-year career with the National Park Service. So he's like 3 years into his retirement almost, and so welcome to the club, John. But in any event, he's been a prolific author. His book on Second Manassas, Return to Bull Run, is considered a classic. I was going to bring it, but then I said to myself, I already have his autograph, I don't really need to bring it. But anyway, a definite classic. At the time of his 2021 retirement, historian Kevin Levin said of John's influence will be felt for decades to come from the many exhibits he has helped to create to his work with the next generation of NPS employees that have been influenced by his leadership. The last 3 decades has witnessed profound changes to how the Civil War era is interpreted at NPS sites, and John was there helping to steer the ship every step of the way. Visitors are now exposed not only to a more expansive narrative, but also to the kinds of questions that serve as a reminder of why these places are so important to preserve in the first place. One could talk for hours, but you came to hear John. So I'm going to turn the microphone over. I heard that, boss. I'm going to turn that microphone over to John, and also this thing here.
Pardon me for 1 second while I get arranged here. All right. Got it. All right. Put this on my body so I can walk around a little bit. There. Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming today. I don't think there are many rooms that I've more often spoken than this one over the years. So it's good to be back. If you want to understand how significant the study group is here, Jane Connor's here today. Now, many of you may know Jane. She is the guru of history in Stafford County. And the measure of something significant with Jane is whether she's willing to travel out of Stafford County. And she is here today. So my job today, my task today is to talk about, get that off the screen there. It's terrible when they put up pictures that show your chronological progression. And then you stand in front of you and it's worse still after all that. Our task today is to talk about the aftermath of the Battle of Fredericksburg. In many ways, many different ways. Now I will say, assuming that you've been to Fredericksburg and you have a general sense of the town, and you have a general sense of the two kind of areas where the fighting took place. One in just beyond the western edge of town in 1862 in front of the sunken road, and then much more expansive fighting in terms of geography south of town on the plantations that were south of town. That's about all you're going to get on strategy and tactics today, because this is a talk that's really focused on humanity more than anything. Let's start with this man. Many of you recognize him as Walt Whitman. Certainly the greatest writer of the era, and in many ways the greatest chronicler of the American Civil War, at least the human experience of it. He kept a small notebook and he jotted down observations and ideas. Now, his brother was slightly wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and his brother's name appeared in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle as a casualty at Fredericksburg. Now, Walt Whitman at the time was a reporter for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and immediately he dropped everything and he came to Fredericksburg. It was his first time coming to the front. It was his first time seeing war up close. And as he did so, he kept a small little notebook in which he wrote wonderful, vivid, Whitman-esque observations about the people that he encountered. Big people, famous people, but mostly just people who otherwise would be virtually unknown to history today. Now, he spent much of his time at Chatham, one of Jane's beloved places, the plantation just across the river from Fredericksburg, overlooking the town, looming over the town in many ways. But while he was here, he arrived here about December 20th, so about a week after the battle, and he would go and first find his brother, realize his brother was hardly wounded at all, and from that perspective, the trip was not necessary. But he then started to circulate through the camps and into the hospitals, notably at Chatham. And one of the notes that he wrote in his notebook was this. He said, "Sight at daybreak, in camp in front of the hospital tent. On stretcher, 3 dead men lying, each with a blanket spread over him. I lift up one and look at the young man's face, calm and yellow. It is strange. Young man, I think this face of yours is the face of my dead Christ." Now this passage that he wrote, which by itself doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense other than his amazement at what he was seeing, evolved into one of his greatest poems. Inciting camp, in the daylight, in the daybreak, gray and dim. This is a poem called A Sight in Camp, in the daybreak, gray and dim. As from my tent I emerge so early sleepless, as slow I walk in the cool fresh air the path near the hospital tent. The 3 forms I see on stretchers lying, brought out where they're intended lying. Over each the blanket is spread, ample, brownish, woolen blanket, gray and heavy blanket, folded, covering all. He goes to the first gray man. A man gaunt and grim, he says. Who are you, my dear comrade? Whitman wonders in his poem. To the second man he goes, a mere boy. And he says, who are you, sweet boy with cheeks yet blooming? In his poem. And then, and I quote again, then to the third, a face nor a child nor very old, calm as a beautiful yellow white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all, and here again he lies. Now, for Whitman, understanding the nature and intensity of war accorded it purpose. Now, he had not, as I said, been to the front before, but he would dedicate his life for the next 3 years to helping, to working in hospitals, to writing letters home for soldiers who could not do it themselves. I often wonder how many addicts in the North have letters home from wounded soldiers that are not written in their hand, but in Whitman's hand. He probably wrote hundreds of such things. And these men shaped this great man, Whitman's, vision of this war they were experiencing collectively. He came to realize very quickly, were doing things he simply could not do himself. Today I ask you to think of a moment, and unfortunately I think all of us have experienced such a moment. The moment after a catastrophe, after 9/11, after a car crash, you hear that thump of a car crash. After, in my case, your chainsaw cuts into your leg. It's happened to me once. It's more funny than anything, but think about that moment. You know, when you hear that impact, or you see that image on the screen, and you wonder, what is it? How bad is it? There's a moment after a car crash where you simply do not know. And it's a moment of terror in many ways. And so our task today is to kind of look at Fredericksburg, the Battle of Fredericksburg, in that moment of uncertainty. After the crash, after the disaster, before we know what it all means. What does it mean? Of course, a battle like this, a human experience like this, has 1,000 different answers, from the very personal and familial to the grand items and issues significant to a nation in history. And so we're going to talk about that moment as it relates to the Battle of Fredericksburg today. Before the dust settled, when thousands struggled to see and understand through a haze of fear and confusion and joy and sadness. What did it mean? What did it mean to me? What did it mean to our nation? What would it mean to our families? Now, a note about the nature of war. Some of you know this far better than I do. I have never experienced war. But the ultimate goal of things military in war is to render the effort so painful to the other side that they decide that the destruction, the anguish, is not worth the struggle. Each battle of the American Civil War leveled a blow that staggered the nation's emotional core, be it north or south. Each battle represented a challenge to the people involved. Commanders bore the weight of a nation, the expectations of a nation. Soldiers bore the weight of fate and the human toll inflicted by battle. Mangled, transformed, dead. Civilians, often unaware, unsuspected, found themselves swept up in a disaster, sometimes in their own backyards, and sometimes hundreds of miles away. The war imposed upon this land, be it in Fredericksburg, in Spotsylvania, or Orange, or in Albany County, New York, a weight that we can hardly imagine today. And so today we're going to talk about how this battle reverberated. What was the experience in that moment after the disaster? Now, the aftermath began before the shooting even stopped. And indeed, before it had hardly begun. During a lull in the bombardment of Fredericksburg on the 11th of December, a local civilian, Edward Heineken, took a walk in the streets. He walked down Princess Anne Street, right in front of one of his best friend's houses, which stood just off to the left of where this camera is today. And this is in the midst, just in a lull in the bombardment. The Confederates have been contesting the Federal crossing of the river. The Federals hadn't crossed yet, and so they had opened fire on the town. Edward Heineken wrote, "I soon left my friend's house to take a walk through town, meeting many people, few in the streets, but many more or less sheltered in their houses, eagerly watching the havoc from doors and windows." And there's a little tidbit about the battle that most of us have never heard. And I must say that few women and men showed any fear, but plenty of excitement. I saw one black man crouching behind a thin plank fence where he imagined himself perfectly safe from shot and shell, cordially inviting me to join him there. Meeting Judge John M. Herndon, whose house is just to the left of the frame of this picture, he remarked in his most pleasant manner, "This looks as if we have had a most extraordinary hailstorm." Notwithstanding all the uproar, Mrs. Guy gave us a very comfortable dinner that night, which seems remarkable in a town like this at such a moment. For soldiers, the aftermath often came quickly and unexpectedly. On the south end of the battlefield, on the north end of the battlefield, at an old tannery that stood along William Street, where the apartments are as you come down from Mary Washington, down to the bottom there, as you're coming down the hill on the right-hand side, there was a tannery there. Private Drake was shot through the neck while on picket in front of this tannery. This is one of his fellow soldiers writing. Fell, staggered to his feet, looked about in a dazed way, tried to reach the corner of the tannery, fell into a ditch with the bullets of the sharpshooter striking the banks near him, staggered to his feet again and looked about in such a pitiful way that flesh and blood could bear it no longer. And a couple of the men behind the tannery rushed forward, seized him, and pulled him behind the sheltering brick walls amid a shower of bullets. Another man described his own wounding. This, again, on the north end of the field. He said, "I was shot just in back of the head by a mini bullet. The ball broke the bone and passed into the head, but has since been taken out. A breath more strength given the ball would have sent it through my head. I'm all right now, and soon will be well." Another man in the 16th Maine fought on the south end of the battlefield. He fell on the field and wrote a letter, the first thing he did. As he lay on the field with the battle swirling around him, he would write what would be his last letter home. "Dear Father, I write you while lying on the battlefield, wounded, perhaps fatally. I am weak. I fell wounded in the side. Goodbye if I never see you again. Tell Mother I think of her while lying here, and I wish I had her to be with me in my last parting moments. Much love to all. I fell while doing my duty. Farewell. I may never see you again on earth, but I hope to meet you in heaven, where there will be no fighting." He died the next morning. You can imagine what must have been running through this man's brain. In his last act, one of his last acts, and he might have considered to be his last act, was to pull out a piece of paper and write that note to his family. When the fighting ended, these men, as you can imagine, caught in the swirl of battle, felt a sense of relief. One of the officers in Parsons' regiment said after the fighting was done, "I felt a strange exultation. I had passed unscathed through the valley of the shadow and was no longer a slave to the fear that had at first nearly overpowered me. I was horribly glad to be alive and unhurt. Back in town, soldiers found their way off the field. Many of them remained on the field, but those who found their way off the field staggered back into the town. Some of them wounded, some of them just exhausted, some of them terrorized. One man from Pennsylvania described as soldiers, some of them sat on the curbstone, meditating, looking gloomily at the ground. Others lay in the pavement trying to forget the events of the day in sleep. There was little said, deep dejection burdened the spirits of all. Always, when anyone spoke, it was of a slain comrade. Thus they lay where they sat. Abner Small, who was so relieved to get out of battle on the south end of the battlefield, wrote more of his feelings that day. He said, "I walked down the line of my regiment, fewer than half of its men surviving, weary and dirty, their clothes torn and muddy, knapsacks rent, canteens battered, hands and faces doubled with muck and splotched with powder. There were pale faces and faces flushed, anxious and expectant faces, many that I had scanned 3 days before, the same, yet they were changed. There was something in the expression, the attitude of these men that awed me. An uprush of emotion blinded and choked me as I turned away." And this was the 16th Fleet's first battle, and it left its mark. What of the wounded? We fail to understand the challenges. I once figured out that within 80 miles of Fredericksburg, not including Washington, D.C., today, there are fewer than 11,000 hospital beds. In Fredericksburg, in December 13th and 14th and 15th, 1862, there were more than 13,000 men wounded. Now, I'm going to kind of untangle some things for you today. We talked about the 13,000 men. There were 9,000 men on more than 9,600 of them on the federal side, so about 4,000 on the Confederate side. And the Confederates had a great advantage. Number one, they already had their hospital services set up on their side of the river, and it was simply a matter of removing people from the battlefield. Any of you who spent time in Spotsylvania County, Mine Road, which runs from 4 Mile Fork or near 4 Mile Fork, behind along the south edge of the park there, was lined with ambulances as they prepared to evacuate the wounded to a railhead at Guinea Station and then on to Richmond. But the fact is, we know relatively little about the Confederate system of medical care at the Battle of Fredericksburg. We know much more about the federal side, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Both sides eventually came to parallel each other in most ways. To give you a sense of how this story starts, at the First Battle of Manassas in July of 1861, when the Union Army, full of enthusiasm, of course, marched out to confront the Confederates on the plains of Manassas, certain of victory, but the Union generals desirous to be able to move as fast as they could. One of the things that they ordered left behind was the entire medical wagon train. Since then, the armies had more important lessons. Much had changed. Now, much of the change on the Union side was due to the man on the left of this photograph, as you're looking at, a man named Jonathan Leatherman. Certainly the most important figure in the evolution of medical care during the American Civil War, and for a couple of years he was associated with the Army of the Potomac and had organized the Army's medical department prior to the Battle of Fredericksburg. He had addressed the quality of physicians, ensuring that they could pass essential competencies. He had paid close attention to the need to transport wounded, and most importantly, he had developed a system of care for the wounded that consisted of forward aid stations, where if you were wounded, you were kind of brought, you could be given emergency care before being sent to a field hospital. transport to a field hospital, which was somewhere ostensibly safe behind the front lines. And then once treated there, and that's where most of the primary care took place, was at field hospitals. And then from there, evacuated back to larger and eventually general hospitals, which were often in Alexandria, for the Federals, Alexandria, and Washington, and Annapolis, and Philadelphia, and places like that. Now, he had started to make these changes before the Battle of Antietam. And in fact, the principles of the system of care that Letterman imposed were very much in fact, still are very much in effect in the moment. If you ever watched MASH, the system of care present during the Korean War, during World War II, was in many ways almost identical and certainly derived from the system at Letterman. Now, by Fredericksburg, there were a couple of new wrinkles in the system. One, the Army now had over 1,000 ambulances. 100,000 man Army, 9,000 wounded, 1,000 ambulances. Doesn't seem like too bad of a ratio. And a robust corps of men assigned to manage those ambulances. There were also a system of division hospitals set up. Now this might get a little bit too much, but it was important. Divisions were, the field hospitals were generally organized by divisions. And that's important because many of those hospitals could be set up and were set up before the battle even started. Many of them in Stafford County, as a matter of fact. But they also developed a system that was reliant not on buildings so much, although the Army still used buildings on a habit, but on tents. And if you walked into a field hospital or a division hospital after the Battle of Fredericksburg, you would have, generally speaking, walked into a small forest of tents. And the result of all this was that at the Battle of Fredericksburg, a disaster for the Federal Army, something worked the way that it was supposed to, and that was the care of the wounded. Now here is a little bit of a busy map. You can see Fredericksburg here. I do have a printer or a pointer. There's Fredericksburg. There's Falmouth. The Federals, of course, were on the Stafford side. This is Stafford County over here. Jane, right there, you know that, right? And most of these hospitals that you circle here reflected divisional hospitals set up, many of them prior to the battle itself. Now on this side of the river, I have not tried to map the field hospitals in town, but these were the field hospitals on the south end of the battlefield that were established during the battle itself. The town itself, as we shall see, became one big hospital. The bandsmen were generally, now bands were starting to make their way out, but there were still bandsmen in the Army, and they were often called upon to help set up these hospitals. And when the Federal Army moved into town on December 11th, and especially the next day on December 12th, which was a day of no major fighting before the big battle on December 13th, Federal troops established hospitals throughout the town of Fredericksburg. Often in public buildings, but not always, rarely in homes, sometimes in stores. One of the biggest hospitals set up was at the Baptist Church. It still stands today. You recognize it. Some of you may attend it. A little battle scarred. This picture was taken in 1864. But the bandsmen were ordered to set it up. One of them remembered, at an early hour, Dr. Cutter called for 14 men, 7 from each band, to go with him into the city to establish hospitals there. I arrived there at daylight and began at once to clear some residences of everything movable. In a short time, we had 4 ready for occupancy. We were then ordered to, and one of those was the orphan asylum, female orphan asylum. Today you know it as Smithsonian, up the street from the church here. In a short time, we were ordered then to clear the Baptist church, which was also done. While this was being done, the armies had met, and the wounded were being rapidly brought in. Quicker, in fact, they were quicker than we could clear the church and the anterooms and the surgeons began to cut and slash. He would also remember that the way they dealt with clearing the upper sanctuary. If you've been in the Baptist church, you know that this is the entrance down here. There's a small meeting room down there that was used for surgery. And then upstairs is the main sanctuary. And they cleared that by taking the pews and simply throwing them out on the window onto the sidewalk on Amelia Street. The regimental hospitals sometimes were set up. Regimental hospitals were more akin to aid stations. But the field hospitals in town, one great account of it describes the wounded are carried into the nearest hospital, a little whiskey is given, and some encouraging words spoken. One whose leg is found to be shattered is placed upon a table that chances to be in the room. Chloroform administered, and the tourniquet applied, and the leg is speedily amputated. The other, whose scapula and upper part of his humerus have been laid bare and shattered, has had some loose splinters gently removed. Now, mind you, most doctors who served as physicians during the war, most of them have probably never even seen a gunshot in their lives. And now they were dealing with the kind of injuries to the human body that there was no science for. In fact, war, that's one of the challenges of war just mangles in horrific ways. And the answers to those problems are not in textbooks. And so these surgeons were dealing with cases unlike anything that they had ever seen. And honestly had no idea how to address. Surgeon of 4th New York established his hospital, quote, in a large room that had been used for the purposes of keeping carriages in. This place was almost certainly on Princess Anne Street, down by the fire station. He said there was room enough to accommodate 50 or 75 of the wounded, and I do not think it was an hour or in fact half an hour before this number was brought in. The roads and streets were very muddy and wet from recent rains, and I was obliged to lay the wounded down upon this muddy, wet, cold floor with only their blankets underneath them, and these in many instances saturated with blood. I had only time to perform such operations and dress such of the wounded as was required by the most urgent necessity, and thus in most cases in a temporary and superficial manner. And all across town, human crises just exploded. In Fredericksburg on the 13th, on the 14th, on the 15th. A man from Pennsylvania said some of the wounded of our regiment were brought into the parlor of the house we occupied, which was elegantly furnished. The first few were but slightly wounded. Then was brought in one who was still a boy. His name was William Wicks, Company D, who was wounded in the groin. He at once recognized me. His groaning was loud and heart-rending. Chaplain, he said, why don't you kill me? It is cruel to let me suffer, so it is a mercy to kill me. I could hardly stand this. I tried to compose him. Medicine was given to deaden the pain, but it was of little avail. He knew he must die. Then came thoughts and fears of eternity, and he spoke to me about his soul. I knelt by his side, offered a short prayer, and done all I could to make his suffering less excruciating. One of the great challenges for chaplains, for those who found themselves working, relief workers, civilian relief workers who found themselves working in hospitals, one of the hardest tasks that they were ever presented with, and they write about it over and over again, was the simple task of sitting next to someone as they died. And they did it over and over again. There were 6 stretcher bearers per regiment, and these men became busy. There were no ambulances on the north end of the battlefield. Every soldier who was moved into a field hospital from what we know as the Bloody Plain, the area in front of the sunken road, was brought off the field either by his own power or by these stretcher bearers. And they were busy. One man in the 24th New York remembered, it was hard work to carry wounded men, not because of their heaviness, but because of their cries and groans. Amputation is, of course, the most famous aspect of Civil War medicine. There are a lot of fallacies associated with it. I won't get into great detail about that, but men were not given a bullet to bite upon. as unschooled as in this sort of thing as many surgeons were or doctors were, they knew very well not to put into the mouth of a struggling man a piece of metal about that big and ask them to control it under pain. And another reason that didn't happen very often, and that didn't happen really at all, I think there's one bullet in America that is demonstrated to have human teeth marks on it, and that's a bullet from the American Revolutionary. It was simply not done. Most surgeons, most surgeries during the American Civil War on both sides, most major surgeries were done with anesthetic. At the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Federal Army was increasing the use of chloroform. They had, up to that point, used almost exclusively ether, which was, of course, less stable, it's explosive, and chloroform was coming into be. So they kept really good statistics about how often they used chloroform during these battles. But there's no question that amputations made an impression on anyone who saw them. One man from Pennsylvania in the Irish Brigade said in the lecture room of the Episcopal Church, 8 operating tables were in full blast. The floor was densely packed with men whose limbs were crushed, fractured, and torn. Lying there in deep pools of blood, they waited very patiently. There was no grumbling, no screaming, hardly a moan. Many of the badly hurt were smiling and chatting. And one who had both legs shot off was cracking jokes with an officer who could not laugh at the humorous sallies for the lower part of his jaw was shot away. The cases here were nearly all capital, and amputation was almost always resorted to. Hands and feet, arms and legs were thrown under each table, and the sickening piles grew larger as the night progressed. The delicate limbs of the drummer boy fell along with the rough hands of the veteran in years, but everyone was brave and cheerful. That's probably not true. We know that they weren't all brave and they weren't all cheerful. But that is a quote that really embodies our perception of the care of wounded in the Civil War, doesn't it? So let me give you some statistics. There were 9,600 Union soldiers wounded during the Battle of Fredericksburg. That number includes men who were slightly wounded, men who asked not to be put on the wounded list, including Walt Whitman's brother, because he knew if he was put on the wounded list, what would happen? His name would appear in a newspaper with nothing more than wounded. But the Army record keepers kept them all and kept track of them all. But how many of those 9,600 were actually treated in hospital? Give me a guess.
Probably less than half.
About half, just a little bit more than half, actually received care in one of the hospitals. Now, there were 7 medical records show that about a little bit more than half were hospitalized. There were 7,048 cases that received some treatment from a medical officer during the war. So of those 7,048 cases that received some medical treatment, how many amputations would you guess were done?
A third?
Mind you, internal surgery was really not an option. There were some examples. Almost all major operations done during the Civil War had something to do with an extremity, and were usually either an excision or an amputation of a limb. So how many amputations do you think were done after the Battle of Fredericksburg out of 7,048 cases? Now you're afraid to answer.
Probably a high number.
7,000.
7,000.
No, 3250.
3250. Okay. The Union Medical Services reported out of 7,048 cases, there were 501 major operations, including amputations. So 2 things about that. Number 1, although wounds to the extremities were were catastrophic, oftentimes, surgeons did not automatically amputate. They often made attempts to save an extremity. And you see this over and over again. The fact that they did excisions, which is the removal of the damaged part of a bone, is really pretty remarkable, because that's the equivalent of 2 amputations on one person. It's a pretty complicated surgery. And then the hope was that the bone would fuse, the arm might be 2 inches shorter, but there might be some use to the arm. And they did a number of those. But the fact is that amputations were not as common. We have this idea that if you cut your finger, they were going to chop it off. Simply not true. And while most wounds that were treated were to the extremities in a significant way, only about 500 major operations were done after the battle in the entire federal line. So that kind of forces us to adjust our assumptions about how medical officers went about the business of treating wounds. They were not slap happy, saw happy, cut them off no matter what. I've never really found an instance where surgeons amputated limbs because it was faster to do that than to treat otherwise. I'm not running, although that is kind of conventional wisdom, I have not run across an account where that was the case. These officers, these medical officers, saved hundreds of lives. So let me ask you another question. Amputation. If your arm or leg is amputated, generally speaking, in the whole body of 500 men times, I think there were 39,000 amputations done during the American Civil War in I think in Virginia. Don't quote me on that. But what percentage of those men would survive? That's the next question. 90%. What was it? 98? Any other guesses?
90 and 80. 2 guesses.
Okay. 90 and 80 or 90 and 80?
90 and 80.
The 90% would survive.
Correct.
That's your answer, right? So the survival rate for, in general speaking, all amputations was around 75%, which is much higher than most people imagine. Most people imagine that if you got a cut or anything, that you're not. Did most of the wounds become infected? Yes. But most, so in fact, you've heard the term laudable pus. It was an expectation. Most surgeons interpreted pus as a sign that the wound was healing. It was not, of course. It was a sign of infection. But most men were able to defeat those infections by virtue of their kind of own immune system. Now, the survival rates vary tremendously depending on where on your body the amputations took place. Closer to the torso, of course, the higher the rate of death. If you had your leg amputated at the thigh, you had probably about somewhere around a 10 to 15% chance of surviving that. If you had your hand cut off, you had a 95% chance of survival. Oddly, the statistics for knees, amputations at the knees, for some reason the survival rates are lower for amputations at the knees, and I've never really seen an explanation for that. But anyway, so lots of mythology, lots of incorrect information floats around out there about the treatment of wounded. At night, on December 13th, one of the remarkable achievements at the Battle of Fredericksburg, especially on the north end of the battlefield, the Army remained on the field, both on the north end and on the south end. But by morning, all of the wounded, I don't mean some, all of the wounded that were within Union lines on both the north end and the south end of the field had been evacuated to field hospitals. On the south end of the field, they were carried back about a half mile by stretcher. Any of you have been to the Fredericksburg Country Club? That was the field hospital for one of the divisions of the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And much went on there. In fact, pretty consistent claims among the medical officers in the Army of the Potomac that when they evacuated town on December 15th, I'll talk about that. So far as I know, they left behind only 20 or 30 wounded that were beyond the reach of the armies. Of course, there may have been among those perceived to be dead between the lines, many wounded as well. But the fact is, they did a remarkable job of evacuating the wounded to the field hospitals. The doctors, like anyone, struggle under the human impact of this spectacle. One wrote, "I confess to you, I did not expect to survive. I was engaged till midnight in amputating and dressing wounds and otherwise providing for sufferers. I was obliged to hear the groans and cries, and without the bursting and screaming of shells, the roar of cannon and musketry, which did not remit for a moment till darkness. The darkness and silence without but served to render the groans and cries of the agony, which arose from the wounded and dying within, all the more instinct." Move ahead here a little bit. On December 15th, the Army decided to retreat. The Federal Army decided to retreat across the Rappahannock. The first job was to evacuate the wounded. Now, as I said, by December 15th, virtually all of the wounded were removed from the battleground itself. They'd been picked up, collected, and moved to hospitals. So now the job was to get those wounded across that river back into Stafford County. And the Federals had a system that worked for that. They used, bear with me here a little bit, ambulances. The Army had sufficient number of ambulances, as I mentioned, 1,000 at the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And a really remarkable scene took place in the town itself, as ambulances by the dozens crossed the river at Ferry Farm, at what we know as the middle crossing there, crossed over to the town dock, and then they went right up Sophia Street, and they waited on Sophia Street. Now all the hospitals were out, most of them were on Prince and Sam Street, some on Caroline Street, none, as far as I know, out on Prince Edward Street, some along Hanover Street coming into town as well. But on the morning of the 15th, the medical officers got the orders to evacuate the town and started moving. One surgeon remembered that he had to have stretchers made from the blinds that were in the building that he was using. They used the frames of the blinds to create stretchers for people to be carried. Others had to simply walk. Oscar Robinson was among those. He said, "My God, spare us the pain of another such sight." He wasn't wounded, but he witnessed it. For 8 long hours, the streets were crowded with the mutilated victims of Saturday's fighting. Those who have use of their limbs are hobbling along as best they can, many on crutches of their own manufacture. Many are leaning for support on those who are slightly wounded. The heart sickens at such a sight. So next time you walk down Hanover Street or William Street in Fredericksburg, you're walking the footsteps of this exodus. And these men are all heading for ambulances that are lined up on Sophia Street. I saw men but slightly wounded carrying another on his back. And yet from all these bleeding and suffering thousands, I never heard a groan or a complaint. Hundreds are left dead about the hospitals. Now, as I mentioned, so this is a line of wagons crossing in 1864 at Ferry Farm. So these wagons are coming down the Far Hill, across just as they did in 1862, and then they would hang a right and go up Sophia Street, and they would wait there. And then as they were loaded, they continued up Sophia Street to the base of Hawk Street, they would turn right onto the pontoon bridges that were laid at Hawk Street right below Chatham, and then they would continue and circle back into Stafford County. It was a very efficient system. And in town, as far as I know, and as far as I can tell, there were no federal wounded left in town when the Union Army retreated out of Fredericksburg. And so, at this point, the focus of all the activity shifts to the pre-established division hospitals in Stafford County. Some along the river, but most of them well back, as far back as White Oak Church and elsewhere. But the most famous of them all, of course, is this one at Chatham, which was a hospital of the Second Corps. And this is where Walt Whitman was, and we have some fabulous descriptions from him. He writes of the place on December 20th, he says, "The house is quite crowded, everything impromptu, no system, all bad enough. But I have no doubt that it's the best that can be done. All the wounds are pretty bad, some frightful. The men in their old clothes, unclean and bloody. Some of the wounded are rebel officers, prisoners. One, a Mississippian, a captain, hit badly in the leg. I talked with him for some time. He asked for papers, which I gave him, newspapers. I went through the rooms, downstairs and up. Some of the men were dying. I had nothing to give at that visit, but wrote a few letters to folks home, mothers, etc. Also talked to 3 or 4 who seemed most susceptible to it and needy." On December 16th, the Federal Army, the 15th and 16th, started evacuating wounded from these division hospitals to general hospitals in Washington. You have an ancestor who was admitted on December 16th, wounded in front of the stone wall, evacuated to Fredericksburg, evacuated across the river. But by December 16th, just 3 days after he was wounded, he is in a general hospital in Washington, D.C. Any of you who have ever read Louisa May Alcott's memoir of her time in the hospitals in Washington, D.C., her time begins or is focused upon this period after Fredericksburg, when the wounded of Fredericksburg come. But there were other aspects to the aftermath of Fredericksburg, because when the Yankees left, of course, the Confederates returned. Now, I would estimate that during the battle, there were probably only several hundred civilians who remained in Fredericksburg throughout the battle. Confederate refugees or civilian refugees were very common. In fact, in early November or mid-November, when the Federal Army arrived, there was a scene of probably couple thousand refugees leaving town. A scene that probably would seem familiar to you if you've seen newsreels of World War II, or even some of the horrors of the Balkans, and even the Middle East today, as these 2,000 or more refugees. And one thing that's interesting, this is a complete tangent here, is that we think of these refugees escaping battle and leaving. But the fact is that many, at least those who could afford it, when they left, they did not immediately come back. Based on the voting records in Fredericksburg, the mayoral elections the council elections were held in April at that time. In fact, they were held in April up until this past election, I think, if I remember correctly, or 2 elections ago. We can tell from the voting returns the percentage of people who were still in town. And on the eve of the Battle of Chancellorsville, there were probably only about 800 people living in town. But what's interesting, that's not really so surprising, but what was surprising to me is that in 1865, more than a year after the war had left the Fredericksburg region directly, still more than half of the town's residents were gone. So this was not a temporary relocation. Those buildings that were abandoned suffered the most, without question. Matilda Hamilton returned to the house of her sister, married to a man named Roy Mason. This is the Sentry Box. This, any of you know Fredericksburg, this is Charlie McDaniel's house on Lower Carolina Street. This is a side view of it taken in 1864. What Matilda Hamilton found was this. We went to the Sentry Box first. It is a wreck. It seemed so calm and beautiful to me last summer. Now it's almost a heap of ruins. All the handsome furniture had been removed, but Sister Charlotte left her wardrobe, a very dear mahogany one, and her bureau, also a very neat bookcase, and a good many pictures, and they were all gone. Under Sister Charlotte's chamber window lay a dead Yankee, died as he fell, for he was on his face. A party of our soldiers with perfect unconcern were laughing and eating in another part of the yard. I saw dead Yankees everywhere. And these descriptions, of course, of Fredericksburg went rocketing across the South, which raised outrage across the South, as you can imagine. One Union or Confederate soldier said, on Wednesday, the 17th, I rode through town. There was scarcely a house in town that doesn't have some mark of the siege. And almost every house that I've ever been inside in Fredericksburg that predates the Civil War has some battle damage in it. Very few of them have visible battle damage on the outside, but most of them have some battle damage on the inside. The large tall houses suffered more than the low buildings. The large Baptist church has 15 large holes through its walls. I think there are 25 or 30 houses burned. A few citizens remained in town, secret in the cellars during the whole siege. Now, I went through the property records, and we have this image of Fredericksburg having been destroyed in the Battle of Fredericksburg. In fact, there are about 960 odd taxable buildings in Fredericksburg in 1860. And of those, about 86 or 87 were either burned or so damaged that they had to be taken down before the end of the war. So the destruction was about 10% of the town. And that's not to say that it wasn't damaged. What caused the most outrage was not the bombardment, but the looting by the Federal Army. That was well chronicled. The Army did something it never had done before, and interestingly enough, and I think this is quite telling about what the Army of the Potomac thought of what it did, it never did it again. There's not another example of the Army of the Potomac doing to a town what it did to Fredericksburg. But the whole thing caused outrage among the Confederates. If we desire a bloody revenge, one of them reflected after the victorious battle, he said, we have gotten it. And a woman would write, or another soldier would write, no victory of the war has ever done me so much good. I hate them worse than ever, speaking of the Yankees. It seems to me that I don't do anything from morning to night, but hate them worse and worse. Across the South, Southerners would raise about $250,000 for the relief of what became known as the Fredericksburg sufferers. $250,000, a lot of money in 1860, too, although it's not quite as much as it seemed because inflation had started, and this was Confederate dollars, of course. The town set up a process, a committee to review claims for damage done by Federal troops, and they received enough claims to distribute about 180 or 90,000 of the money raised. And the rest of it, what they do with the rest of the money, do you think? They had about $50,000 to $60,000 left. Being a patriotic little town in Virginia, they bought Confederate war bonds, which did not turn out really well. And then, of course, came the ordeal of burying the dead. Excuse me, we'll go through these. Some of these are familiar to you. On the bloody plain in front of Maurice Heights, this plain was not covered with dead, but there were probably somewhere near about between 800 and 900, or perhaps as many as 1,100 dead on this plain. Really an area between Hanover Street on the right and what was then kind of an unnamed road, but now known as Lafayette Boulevard on the left. And those burials would be undertaken during a flag of truce 3 days after the Federal Army retreated. The Confederates looted the dead freely and admitted it freely. In fact, one man said the battlefield plunderers may be divided into three cases. The first upon the field run hastily along from corpse to corpse, inverting the pockets, keeping an eye to watches and jewelry. The next class are content with canteens, boots, greatcoats, and pants. And the last are gleaners, who have to put up with underclothing. These are still at work, even while the burial party are performing the last offices for the dead. Heros von Bork described this area near the Stratton House. The Stratton House still stands. The house on the edge there, this is the sunken road as it turns down what is today Kirkland Street. That's the Ebert House on the right-hand side of this. He said many of the federal soldiers found death seeking shelter in the small courtyards of the houses behind the wooden plank fences surrounding them. This is an 1866 photo. And heaps of the corpses of these poor fellows filled the narrow enclosures. And probably the single most horrific place on the battlefield is along a fence that stood right about here. And there was an orchard. In fact, if you look closely, I think you can see some of the remnant stumps of the orchard that stood behind the Stratton House there. On the space of ground over 2 acres, we counted 680 dead bodies, and more than 1,200 altogether were found in the plain between the Heights and Fredericksburg, he said. One Confederate said, the worst sight I saw was 3 days afterwards. I didn't mind the heaps of dead or nothing, but just a starving dog sitting by a corpse, which he wouldn't let anyone come near, and which he never left night or day. By George, that just about made me cry. We finally had to shoot the dog to get at the man so we could bury him. During the truce, about 200 to 300 federal soldiers came across and undertook to bury the dead on the bloody plain. They made 2 major burial trenches, which ultimately held the bodies of probably just about 1,000 men in all. And then there was the burials at the hospitals. And this, the brightness of this, isn't it? But here's a camp of the Vermont Brigade. I was talking to someone about the Vermont Brigade, a Vermont soldier. Anyway, this is the camp, and in front of this is the cemetery. You really can't see it there. Whitman encountered men of the 51st New York digging graves. He said there was a row of graves there already, each with a slat of board, generally a piece of barrelhead, on which they had inscribed the name of the soldier. Death is nothing here. As you step out in the morning from your tent to wash your face, you see before you on a stretcher a shapeless extended object, and over it is sewn a dark gray blanket. So this is another reference to that very scene he described at the beginning. Perhaps there's a row or 3 or 4 of these corpses lying covered over. No one makes an ado. All useless ceremony is omitted. So in the National Cemetery of Fredericksburg are more than 15,300 burials that we know of. About 15,000 of them from the Civil War period. Just 2 interesting things. If you include of the 4 battles, and so these are from the battlefield, 4 battlefields around here: Mine Run, North Anna, the camps in Stafford County. Which do you think probably has the highest number of identified dead? Now, I'll give you a little preface in that. Of the 15,300 dead, 12,800 of them are unknown. It's the highest percentage of unknown in any national cemetery anywhere, Fredericksburg. What percentage of them, which of the 4 battles would you guess has the lowest percentage of unknown dead, or of identified dead in the Fredericksburg National Cemetery? Any guesses? Well, you've got only a few, so Bob, try 6 guesses and you get 1 right.
Chancellorsville.
Chancellorsville? So that the correct number is Fredericksburg. The nearest to town you would think would have the highest percentage of identified dead, but it actually has the lowest percentage. Here's another question for you. Of the 7 categories I just sent you, sources of dead, if you will, 4 battlefields, camps in Stafford, mine run on North Anna, which contributed the highest number of dead to the burials in the National Cemetery? Fredericksburg? Any other answers? Jane, you want to answer? Stafford County. The camps of Stafford County, there were more dead taken out of the Union camps in Stafford County than any of the 6 other battlefields represented at the National Cemetery.
Is that by disease?
Yes, by illness. And deaths at field hospitals. Some of them after the battle itself. One of the remarkable facts, Fredericksburg has the lowest percentage. And on the bloody plain in front of Fredericksburg, that image I showed you there, of the nearly 1,000 men who were recovered from the bloody plain, we know the identity of 2 of them. Which is, when I realized that, I was surprised by it. So the word of Fredericksburg travels across the nation. Letters like daggers fly with the news of what has happened at Fredericksburg. One goes to Georgia, where the wife of Captain Edwin P. Lawton, who fell wounded and was captured by the Federals on December 13th, carried back across the river by the Federals. Word goes to Georgia to his wife that she has been wounded. Evelina is her name. We don't have a picture of her. We have a picture of her husband. And she immediately drops everything and leaves her home in Georgia and travels to Richmond, gets a pass to Fredericksburg, looking for her husband. She's informed when she gets to Fredericksburg that Edward Lawton has been captured and is in federal hands, but he's alive. And so she receives a pass to cross into federal lines and to travel to Alexandria. Now, the day that she chose, the moment that she chose, she probably came across by boat, probably at the Upper Conjun Crossing near Chatham. Went to Falmouth Station on the railroad, which is where the Eagles Lodge now stands on Cool Spring Road. And she got into a rail car there that happened to be returning to Washington that day with the Vice President of the United States, Hannibal Hamlin. And Hamlin sat with the woman, consoled her, and talked with her all the way back. She traveled northward to apply landing and then by steamboat to Alexandria. She got to Alexandria, and when she got there, she was informed that her husband had recently died. And so now her mission changed, and that was to carry her husband's body back to their home. So she got a coffin, was helped by folks in Alexandria in that, and then retraced her steps. First to Aquia Landing, then to the railroad, then to Falmouth Station. Pulled into Falmouth Station. The train emptied. It was not just for her, of course. There were lots of people on it. No one paid much mind to her. And as the train emptied, she was left alone in her car with the coffin, holding her husband's body. At that moment, a Union colonel who was on Edmund Sumner's staff appeared at the train station. He was a kind of a fatherly-looking son-in-law of General Sumner. He had been ordered to the station to meet 2 other women who had been traveling so that they could go through lines to the south, but found instead Evelina Lawton in her car, attired, as he said, in deep mourning. He took her hand, said she extended it with such an air of sadness, even despair. He called for the officer of the day, and soon Mrs. Lawton and the coffin were out on the platform with the honor guard over them. They shortly departed for the Phillips house nearby, no longer stands. She seemed so thankful and submissive, Teal wrote that night, and overnight, Captain Lawton's coffin sat in an ambulance in front of the house. The next day, Teal gave the order to transport it to the crossing, to the upper crossing, so it could be ferried across the river. After giving the order to proceed, I took my seat beside Mrs. Lawton, and this little procession moved slowly toward the river. She was entirely ignorant of the demonstration of respect to her husband's remains, and as our ambulances turned into line and the escort moved solemnly with arms reversed to the music of 2 muffled drums, her surprise was instant and complete. I saw her struggle. She turned to me and said, "Colonel, I needn't tell you how gratified I feel," and she burst into tears. Oh, what a moment of anguish this is. Was this of grief pure and intensified. It was more than I could bear, and I involuntarily gave way to myself, to the pressure of this scene. She crossed the Rappahannock at the upper crossing below Chatham and transported her husband to Jasper County, South Carolina, where he lies today. She never married. She never remarried. This is true for many, many veterans of the Civil War. She later moved to Charleston and ran a boarding house until her death in 1893. This man also died at Fredericksburg, but not right away. He was taken to a hospital in Alexandria. Writes home, "You have heard of my being wounded," he told his family. "I presume, but I do not know how bad. The ball entered just the side of the cap of my joint and is now in my arm. The surgeon cannot find it. I have been wounded 1 week, and the wound is doing well. I have suffered considerable pain, but it is not so bad now." He was admitted to the hospital, and he would reside in the hospital there until January 13th, 1863 in Washington, and he died on January 13th, 1863. And then finally, this story from Confederate pen, writing home to his cousin, Sally, about the death of Richard W. Milner, who was her husband. "Dear cousin Sally, it is with feelings of sadness that I attempt to write you this evening. For I suppose ere this reaches you, you will have heard that Dick is no more. He died in the night of the 16th, having been wounded severely, Sunday last. He lived about 2 days and a half after receiving the wound, and he died about 11 o'clock. At the same time and by the same ball, Clem Maddox was killed. They, with 2 others, having been detailed to go after water, were struck by a cannonball. Dick's left arm was badly shattered near the shoulder, and the arm amputated there. He was buried on the farm of Captain John Alsop, 5 miles from Fredericksburg, within 200 yards of the Richmond and Fredericksburg Railroad, under a small persimmon tree, near 2 other graves, under a larger persimmon. I have been this precise, thinking you would probably at some time wish the body sent for. Cousin Sally, you will please accept our heartfelt sympathies at your sad bereavement. No one feels this loss more keenly than I do. My heart saddens at the pain and anguish this wicked war has caused. P.S. Those who attended the burial say the corpse was interred decently in a coffin, much better than soldiers usually are." In the Camden, New Jersey Democrat of December 23rd, 1862 appeared this short notice. One of the saddest events connected with the Battle of Fredericksburg is the death of the Sergeant Major of the 15th New Jersey, John P. Fowler, of Franklin Furnace. He was struck in the leg by a rifle ball and bled to death in less than 5 minutes. He was a large, powerful man, brave and generous to a fault. He leaves a widow and 9 children to mourn his loss. Inscribed on his tomb, he died for the maintenance of the Union, the Constitution, and the laws. But most died without much notice at all, and a few had so much as an observation. This is one from Walt Whitman, writing about Charlie Parker, Company C, 51st New York. He said, "Then I heard of Charlie Parker, a young man in Company C of the 51st. Now he was shot in the advance at Fredericksburg, died hard, suffered much, frothed at the mouth. His body on the return found entirely stripped by the secession, and was decently buried by his companions. He was a noble, beloved young man, a clean, gallant soul, lad of the 51st of old Brooklyn." Now, the great irony of war, to a point, the suffering of both sides. Remember at the beginning, I talked about how the intent of war is to inflict pain sufficient to convince the other side to stop, that what they wish to accomplish is not worth the sacrifice. But one of the ironies of war is that to a certain point, the suffering inflicted steels the other side, makes them more determined to exact revenge or to survive. We, of course, saw that in Britain, certainly during World War II. But beyond a certain point, a nation can waver. And some in the Union did after Fredericksburg. Walt Whitman spent about a week near Fredericksburg in 1862. He would sense and understand the reverberations of what happened here. For him, the experience brought clarity of purpose, and he rendered everything else irrelevant in his life. He wrote a letter to his mother on December 29th, and he said, "And now that I have lived for 8 or 9 days amid such scenes as the camps furnish, and had a practical part in it all, and realized the way that hundreds of thousands of good men are now living, and have had to live for a year or more, not only without any of the comforts, but with death and sickness and hard marching and hard fighting and no success at that. For their continual experience, really nothing we call trouble seems worth talking about." So the revelation for Whitman, you remember his reference to the soldier as the face of Christ, was really his recognition of the stakes involved, and the sacrifices involved in this war, and his testament to the astounding courage displayed in this quest for nation and for hope. And one thing that I have learned is that those who understand best are almost always the most committed. And Whitman became committed after Fredericksburg. And so I would suggest it's helpful for all of us to try to understand. At Fredericksburg, sacrifices, sadness, hurt, destruction, and death came in a fashion and in forms not seen before, affecting soldier and civilian alike, challenging the will of all. What's truly amazing is that against this backdrop of horror, and fully aware of what was coming, they still came. The soldiers, the civilians endured it. Each side committed to a very different vision for a nation, but each side hopeful for better lives for themselves. Lieutenant Powers of General Stuart's staff wrote a letter home on December 25th, 1862. He told his wife, "I hardly have the heart to wish you a Merry Christmas this beautiful Christmas morning, because I know well merriment is not for you this day. I thought of the children when I first awoke this morning, and wondered what you managed to put in their stockings. Memory went back to the many happy Christmas days we have spent together with them. Alas, will the good old times ever return again, and you and I and our little ones dwell together in peace? I hope so. I believe so. But the heart sickens with that deferred hope." So Lieutenant Powers' hope, and the hopes of every soldier on that field, to return home, to find happiness again, is in fact our reality. And so we ought to revel in it. These men did not die so that we could mourn, they died so we could live the life that we live today. And we ought to celebrate that. But not forget that in Fredericksburg and many places like it, it was not always so. Thank you all. I'm happy to take whatever questions you may have.
I have two quick ones.
Two questions. Oh, she wrote them down.
When the ambulances were lined up on Sophia and started hauling, were they going ultimately to Belle Plaine or to Aquia?
So ultimately, most of the wounded were evacuated via the railroad, mostly at Falmouth Station, although some of the division hospitals were farther north on the line at Brook Station and elsewhere. And the railroad to Aquia Landing, and then by steamboat to Washington or other points north. Belle Plaine was not extensively used as a debarkation point in 1862. It would be used in 1864, but not in 1862.
And why did the Battle of Fredericksburg contribute the most number of unidentified in the cemetery?
So, the National Cemetery, the intent of creating the National Cemetery is to bring order out of this horror and chaos. To bring dignity to something that was as undignified as you could possibly imagine. And there was no more undignified place than the plain in front of Fredericksburg during the week after the battle there. Most of the dead were buried in the trenches. And so there was no attempt to identify any of them, or very few of them. Two identities survived. So let's say, the battle that has the highest percentage of identified dead is actually Spotsylvania. Which you wouldn't think. You think of Spotsylvania as being the most horrific of them all. But in fact, the Federal Army controlled much of the place where Federal troops had fought for days after the battle. And so they were able, most of the dead, there were no mass burials that we know of in Spotsylvania. Most of the dead were buried in individual graves. And most of those graves were marked by people. And so I think 23% of the dead disinterred from Spotsylvania are identified in the National Cemetery today. So it goes back to the very circumstances on the ground and the immediate aftermath that helps explain this. But very good questions. You have this.
Yeah, first, great lecture, really great lecture. Mrs. Lawton's story is quite a moving story.
Isn't it?
Yeah, as well as many of the other ones. Wasn't it Lee who said at Fredericksburg, if war wasn't so terrible, one would learn to love it?
If war were not so terrible, we should grow too fond of it.
We should grow too fond of it.
Whether he actually said that or not is kind of an interesting question, but certainly I think we all understand the sentiment.
Right.
Especially, because, even today, we kind of treat war as sports sometimes.
Yeah.
We look at these battles as kind of sports, we get excited and we go out and pretend to kill each other all over again.
A video game. Yeah. I do have a question. Did you ever see the John Ford movie, Horse Soldiers?
When I was a kid, I did.
Yeah, because it touches on a lot of the medical, the battlefield medical treatment that your lecture covered on.
Yeah. I wonder if they got it right. I don't remember.
Well,
Gone with the Wind
Yeah.
establishes America's relationship and understanding of medical care during the Civil War. And it's just a silly representation. But it lives. The whole idea of biting the bullet, the whole idea that, anesthetic wasn't used. I have found maybe 2 major surgeries that were done during the war. That's not to say there weren't more, but I have encountered, and I've looked at hundreds and hundreds and thousands of cases, only 2 that were done without anesthesia of major operations. There were lots of minor. If you needed a bullet extracted from, the flesh in your chest, they were going to just cut that and take it out. They were not going to put you under.
Well, it starred John Wayne and William Holden, and the conflict between the two was how long do you remain, because it was about the Garrison,
Or Gerson rate.
Yeah,
Right.
right. And so Wayne was supposed to be Garrison or Garrison, and he was on the move. He was kept moving.
Right.
And William Holden was the medical surgeon, and he said, "Well, wait a minute, we gotta wait a little while we can do this." So the conflict was, between the two was about that.
So just to extrapolate that, one of the things that people kind of recoil at is the fact that amputations were done in carriage houses and backyards and barns, and they were done quickly often. In terms of the lapse of time, they were done relatively quickly after the wound was received. Letterman reported that I think he uses the word all, he might have said almost all of the major operations, that is to say amputations, were completed before the Army recrossed the river. So we'd say, well, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they wait until they got back to, places that were more kind of permanently established, with better infrastructure, all of that. Well, there is, and I looked at it myself. Years ago, I did at Manassas, I did a search of all the medical records I could find and calculate mortality rates and all that sort of stuff. And the longer the lapse between the wound and the treatment, the primary treatment, even if it was major surgery, the longer the lapse, the higher the mortality rate. And doctors knew that. And so any risks associated with doing something at the front or near the front or in a field hospital as opposed to a division hospital or a general hospital was statistically well worth it. And that's why they undertook surgeries under oftentimes pretty difficult conditions.
Just one more question, please.
Yes, ma'am.
It might be of interest to anyone. One of the houses that you emphasize, the last name is Box,
Oh, the Sentry Box.
Sentry Box.
Yes.
That's actually on the garden tour.
Yeah.
It's open to the public on Tuesday.
Yes.
I'm planning
Good
to go
plug.
there.
Very
I was
well
going
done.
to say,
Very well done.
I'm sure it doesn't look like that picture.
No,
like ready
it's
to fall
one of
down.
the most beautiful houses in town. Yeah, absolutely. But anyway, thank you all for coming out.
So thank you very much, John. Appreciate it as usual. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.